Well, as it turns out, whenever the heart beats, you have the current flows in the body. They also radiate magnetic fields. Produce magnetic fields, which easily radiate right through the skin and out into the environment around us. Now, how do I know that? Well, stick a different device called a magnetometer, which measures magnetic fields out here in space in front of the body and measure the heart's magnetic field. Yeah, and I think relevant to what you guys are talking about on your interviews and shows a lot, it's also through those same years is when a lot of our natural kindness and compassion and stuff kind of gets beat out of us. Yeah. So I just kind of use that as a backdrop or an analogy for what I mean, to where we start evolving to where it makes more sense, even for our own. And many studies bear out what I'm about to say here, that it's really collaborating with others and being kind and compassionate is the best for our own careers and certainly for our relationships. I was just, before you even invited me to this, I was just reading something. What women want most in men is kindness.
Hello, my name is Clay Boykin, and I am in search of the new compassionate male. I believe in the midst of these incredible times of change, a new compassionate male is emerging as the new archetype, and this podcast is intended to give voice to both men and women on the overarching topic of compassion consciousness in men.
Hello, world. It's me, Dennis, and welcome to In Search of the New Compassionate Male. I'm the co-host, and I'm here with the founder and my partner, Clay Boykin. Hello, Clay.
Hey, Dennis. How you doing?
Doing great.
Good. Today we have, and I'm thrilled to say, Dr. Rollin McCraty. Dr. McCraty is the director of research for the HeartMath Institute, an organization that I knew many years ago, lost track of, and I'm anxious to hear what he's got to share with us today. He's also a professor at Florida Atlantic University, and he is a psychophysiologist, and he studies the physiology of emotion.
Welcome. Welcome, Rollin. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. And it was great to rediscover Clay. I think we probably met, 18, 20 years ago, maybe, something like that.
I think so. I was with Motorola at the time in Austin, and I think y'all were doing some work with Motorola, maybe in Florida.
A few places, actually.
Yeah, a few places.
During that era.
Yeah, and I had the occasion to fly out and spend a little time and then come back. But I always remember that.
Yeah, I'm an ex-Motorola person myself.
That's right. Were you in Phoenix?
No, I was a communications engineer, so I was a field engineer. I went out and fixed the stuff, for police, fire departments when the locals couldn't. I was that guy that.
Got it. Well, I'm an old semiconductor guy, so I put the stuff in the stuff that you fixed.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
How wonderful. And I'm a consumer. So Motorola happened to be, as I take this right out of, this is a Motorola phone. So I'm a consumer. This is the great-great-grandchild of all the work that you guys have done.
Yes. Well, and unfortunately, maybe not unfortunately, but Motorola is now owned by a Chinese company, I think, if I'm...
Well, see, as is so much of what we're doing, and what a time to be alive, Rollin. When we talk about, there's so much really learning and relearning and rediscovering, and so I want to start about what psychophysiology. Could you please? How do you say that at a cocktail party? How do you describe your field?
Well, it's really understanding I guess I could say it this way: the interface between how we feel, how we think and feel, and what goes on in the activity in our bodies. That's the psycho part, right?
Right.
It's feelings, behaviors, and physiology. I could say the underlying activity in our brain and nervous system and hormonal system. But, our research is really saying that you can't quite look at it that way because it's just as much as what's going on in our thoughts, feelings, intuitions.
Yes.
That are really driving the activity in our body, in our nervous system, and our hormonal system. So it's kind of different way of thinking of it, but that's really what I would say the data really suggests. It's really what's going on. And I don't know how wide the audience is here, but I tend to call these our energetic systems.
Yeah.
You know, the vibrations, because they are. You just can't put an emotion or a thought or an intuition under a microscope. Right.
But when we talk about string theory and we talk about the work that everything is a vibration, that if matter and energy can be interchanged, then the vibrations there are what creates whatever we look upon. It collapses. Mm-hmm. So how could they not be interchanged?
Well, right. Well, yeah, in the modern world, but there's still a lot of people that have kind of the blinders on.
Well, yeah, there were a lot of people that had the blinders on with Copernicus or with, these are all the things that we're learning. One of the things that Clay and I talk about is that radio waves existed before an instrument happened to detect.
Well, absolutely. Right. I mean, and so much of what from my perspective, what we discover and there's certainly great advances going on in material science and technology and all that, no question. But, our fundamental really understandings of how the universe and life, especially life, works, there hasn't been any significant advance in over 100 years.
That's exciting. So what impelled you? Clay, I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate this.
Keep rolling. I'll jump in.
Rollin, what impelled you to go in the direction of this? From being a Motorola engineer, here you are, a Motorola engineer. You're out there working. But there was an impelling to get you in this direction.
Well, that's a long story, but I think even before my engineering, times, I was military, and then the University of Nebraska, and then Motorola, and there was always something in me. Even back to high school, I was a kid who was building Heathkit radios and transmitters, and in junior high and high school through that era, and I kind of grew up. My grandfather was a small town mechanic, right? So I, from a very early age, grew up in that kind of world, and so I was always asking questions like, well, what is a magnetic field anyway? And nobody could ever answer that. I mean, they give you formulas, and which I've forgotten most of now, to be honest, but describing the behavior of them. And we're really good at that. We can make radio waves carry information, and like we did at Motorola and still do. But the point I was there's two questions that I think you're addressing there. One is what we discover in a lot of things is really mimicking what biology already does, if that makes sense. As we talk about radio waves, well, as it turns out, and some of our work shows that we are broadcasting radio waves, and that those waves, not radio waves, but electromagnetic waves, and that those waves carry information just like we would use in a cell phone. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what we discover is really, nature is already figured out and doing much more efficiently than the technology we invent to try and mimic what's already going on.
So that would say that there's a field around us.
Well, there is.
I want to explain that to me. I mean, I can't touch it.
Yeah. Well, I'll do that. But to finish your other question, so I had a good time at Motorola. Don't get me wrong, but there was always a deeper something, right? And I wasn't quite, I guess, wired to to play the male, I guess you could say, game, especially for this and the corporate thing. So I actually left that world. First I went to Miami, still working for Motorola in another context. I was supposed to oversee the installation of a countrywide communication system in Colombia. And that fell through. I actually found out many years later why that fell through after I'd already been hired to do the job. But that's another story. And after that, my interests, I found a book that it was actually about a field called Radionics, which is a kind of a more different perspective on biological fields and ray waves and stuff. And that got me intrigued. And that's kind of what got me into the study of consciousness. And so I packed up my stuff and moved to California to get a degree in consciousness studies. One of the first degrees and the first universities that gave degrees in that, a small accredited university, actually ended up being here in Boulder Creek, California. And then that got me into meditation, that kind of things. And I won't go through the whole story, but then let's just say, I get through that crowd of people was part of a group that introduced spirulina to the world. You may not have heard of that, but it's a superfood.
Oh, yes. It's a superfood, isn't it?
You can actually live on it, and that got proven many times. And so this kind of opened my heart a little bit, I think you could say, to...
And what years were these?
This would have been the 1970s, late 70s.
Okay, good. All right.
And the early 80s was the spirulina thing. And, as life unfolded, actually National Enquirer did a cover story on spirulina. And anyway, we went from a company selling about 150,000 a month and this stuff through the health food stores and consumers and things to, I think I personally wrote about $20 million of business in the next 2 weeks. So it was a, just way huge jump. Sure. That's its own story. I don't want to go into all that, how we pulled that off, but the point of the reason I wanted to share this of the history was we took the profits of that, and because we really were a motive to feed the world's hungry populations. Why we were doing this, because I could care less about it otherwise, frankly. So we took the profits of that and went to Southern California, out in the middle of a desert, and proved you could actually grow spirulina in the middle of a desert and feed the world's hungry populations. You could set these up locally, and problem solved, right? Way ahead of our time. I mean, we had these giant solar-powered spray dryers and things to process it. It was all there. It all worked. And that went absolutely nowhere in terms of solving hunger problems. Mm-hmm. In hindsight, I talk about that's when my idealism bubble got popped, because here we are, I mean, because even through, my other studies and practices, and I probably need to say here, I was grounded enough in my electrical engineering side of things that I never got too far into the wacky stuff.
Right.
If that makes sense. I was always pretty grounded through it. But anyway, through that era, we talk about consciousness. It's really all about consciousness and da-da-da-da-da. And so after that experience, that became a felt knowingness, if I could say it that way, more than a concept. Mm-hmm. And so basically after that experience and realizing how it was blocked, it was really consciousness problems. It was people, leaders of countries and things. I basically said, well, the heck with this humanitarian stuff. I'm going to go make money again. That's what I did. So I started a company in electrostatics and kind of went into that field. And we grew to a multi-million-dollar company in just a very short time, 2 or 3 years. And that was a fun ride too. I mean, I had a great time through that. But there was still that deeper yearning, mm-hmm. I think what I incarnated with, probably more likely, looking back even into my childhood, that I really wanted to do something, to better the world, not just my own life. And so another sports car in a driveway wasn't kind of doing it. And so then I met Doc Childry. I kind of vowed to myself that I'm not going to get re-involved in this humanitarian type things or, doing good for the world, unless it's something that can really shift consciousness, at people and in a mass scale, because otherwise I might as well go have a good life and make lots of money. And
exactly. I mean, when you talk about shifting consciousness, let's take this smartphone. No technology has ever been adopted as quickly mm-hmm. as the smartphone has, from not being there to how quickly people are. So that was a shift in consciousness, right? So a shift in consciousness from a mechanical standpoint?
No, that's not how I mean it. I'm talking about something quite different. Let me give you another example.
Please.
I used to say, not that many years ago, that so I'd read this, in some papers and things, that with 10% of the world's military budget, that every human being on planet Earth could be fed, have clean water, educated, and have housing, mm-hmm. at least all their basic needs met.
Exactly.
10% of what we spend on war and bombs and that kind of nonsense, right? But I could never find the reference until about 3 years ago when I met Cilla Ellsworthy. who's actually been nominated for three Nobel Peace Prizes. And in fact, I've got her book laying around. Here it is, Business Plan for Peace. She's going to be a speaker at one of our upcoming events here.
Wonderful.
And but that was really neat because she did the hardcore math and work on it. And when I was saying 10%, I was wrong. It's far less than 10%.
Wow.
Is this not a problem in consciousness? See, it's not technology. We don't need another iPhone or smartphone, or we have everything right now and have had for years that would solve these problems. This is clearly a problem in human consciousness. Does that make sense? Does that help give you what I'm talking about?
It absolutely does, because this is wonderful. All right, continue.
Okay. So anyway, it's that's our own growth in how we are able to self-regulate and really be more inclusive and compassionate and kind, and
that's why we're in search of, right, Clay?
It absolutely is. We've been, for the past 2 years, we've been talking to men and women all over the world. Mm-hmm. And, that's why we call it In Search of the New Compassionate Male. Mm-hmm. I may be an idealist, but I think that, and I believe that underneath all of the negative things that we're seeing out in the world, that there's an undercurrent of compassion, and that there's a shift that's coming, and we're in the midst of, where compassion consciousness is going to rise up. Yeah. And that's why I was particularly interested in talking with you to compare notes on what you think about that.
Well, we have an annual event that we do on one of our projects called the Global Coherence Initiative, and the title of it is The Rise of Collective Compassion. That's in March. It's 3 days, 3 half days, March 18th, 19th, and 20th, I believe. But
are you doing it both virtually and on site?
Yeah, we're having to do. We used to do these as big gatherings. We used to go to invite everybody to Cancun, and they were great events that we had down there. This will be about our 8th year, but the last year and this year we're having to do it virtually because of the obviously we're in the pandemic era here right now.
Wow! So HeartMath Institute orchestrates and puts that on globally.
Yeah.
My goodness.
So, which is part of our, as I mentioned, Global Coherence Initiative, which is one of our projects. I don't know how wide you guys want to get here, but
I think I want to go there. Somewhere along the line, I want to hear about that.
Let me tie this back in then to your question you asked me a few minutes ago, Clay. When you asked me about we radiate fields, well, absolutely. So, and it's sometimes people will push back on this, and it's just the absolute craziest thing. One of the books on my bookshelf back here is a book on bioelectromagnetism, and there's a drawing in it from 1863 where people had actually externally measured the fields of the body and had it right. So it's not like this is something I invented, right? I mean,
sure.
And every hospital has equipment to measure what's called MCG. Well, let me back up. When we put electrodes across the body to measure your heartbeat, the electrocardiogram, or on your head to measure brain waves or the EEGs, what those devices are literally measuring is current flow, right? They're differential amplifiers. That probably you know what I mean, Clay, by that.
Well, I was in marketing, so maybe not.
Okay, I thought I'm thinking you're Motorola. You must have some electronics background. But anyway,
Clay, just nod when.
Yes, of course I know.
Of course I know. I use differential amplifiers all the time.
Of course.
So basically, you're measuring the flow of electricity.
Right.
That's really what it is. That's why it's called the electrocardiogram or electroencephalograph for measuring brain waves. So whenever this is physics 101. I mean, whenever you have a flow of electrical current, you create a magnetic field, right? So, and the heartbeat is by far the largest source of rhythmic electrical magnetic energy in the body. Mm-hmm. So we measure the heartbeat in millivolts, and you measure brain waves in microvolts, order of magnitude greater, right? So, all right, let's use our cell phone analogy. You held yours up, so I'll hold mine up here. I've got one too. So cell phones work indoors, right?
Yes.
Well, those invisible waves are going through the wall. Well, it's the magnetic component that's going through the wall, right? And that's what we're using to carry your voice or the picture, whatever. We're modulating that signal. something I know a little bit about from my old days, right, and my original career. Well, as it turns out, whenever the heart beats, you have the current flows in the body. They also radiate magnetic fields. Produce magnetic fields, which easily radiate right through the skin and out into the environment around us. Now, how do I know that? Well, stick a different device called a magnetometer, which measures magnetic fields out here in space in front of the body and measure the heart's magnetic field. Now, most large hospitals have devices called MCGs, magnetocardiogram, where you don't touch the body with anything physical. You measure the field of the body. Now, I'm not going to go into why that's better for why hospitals have them, but I don't think that'd be that interesting right now. But the point is, every time the heart beats, we radiate a magnetic field, and you can back up that magnetometer about 3 feet before you lose the capacity to detect the heart's field. You take the same sensor, you back up you can measure also brainwaves externally without touching. You back up about an inch before you lose, right, the capacity to detect that signal. So clearly the heart's the big player here. This goes back into the 90s in our research here at the HeartMath Institute. Using about the same techniques I would have used back in my Motorola days to decode or demodulate the information being carried by, in this case, a radio wave to carry the signal. You use them the same thing, just applied those to the heart signal, and lo and behold, you could demodulate and see the information patterns carried by the field. And not only that, you can actually hook yourself up and get the right equipment and watch these frequency patterns change in real time as we change our emotional state.
Now, is that anything like biofeedback?
Well, we can take that. We actually developed the first consumer level biofeedback. So yes and no.
Okay.
Right. So biofeedback is a kind of a term. And
right.
You're measuring something and feeding back the result. So looking in a mirror and smiling is a form of biofeedback. Mm-hmm. So what underlies those information being patterns that we are literally broadcasting, that we are radiating into the field, we can call it your personal field environment, has to do with what's called heart rate variability. And so what that is, and you would remember this from what we taught probably back when you were here many years ago, Clay, but in a healthy person, our heart rate changes with every heartbeat. So most people know what heart rate is, right? Just simply how many times does the heart beat in a minute. But in reality, our heart rate's changing with each and every heartbeat. So there's always varying time between each consecutive pair of heartbeats. And that actually is a way that the physiology encodes information, is the space between things.
So there's really no such thing as a steady heartbeat?
Not in a healthy person. In fact, if your heart rate becomes metronomic-like, that is one of the strongest indicators of serious future health problems.
Wow.
And that predicts things like cancer, sudden cardiac death, metabolic, a whole list of things is not a good thing. And so physiologically speaking, you could think of it as a simple form of Morse code. Of course, physiology is a lot more complex than longs and shorts, but it's the same process. Mm-hmm. And that heart rhythm, this is what underlies our heart rhythm. The patterns of that, this is going back to our early work in the 90s again, is the most reflective of a person's emotional state. So our heart rhythm pattern becomes very chaotic looking when we're feeling anxious or frustrated or impatient, not compassionate, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas what was really surprising in a way, going back to the early 90s in our work, was that our bodies and our physiology literally shifts into a completely different functional or operational mode when we're feeling heartfelt feelings. And I use that word because thinking doesn't work. You can think appreciation, oh, thank you for opening the door for me. But when you feel it, that's what drives physiology, is the emotion of it, the feeling. But when we feel things like appreciation or compassion, which are all part of the love spectrum in my way of thinking, that shifted the physiology into a completely different mode that we actually figured out what to call. It took us a few years, but we ended up calling coherence, which has become a term all over the place now in terms of physiological functioning. And so as it turns out, we actually have what is called a resonant frequency. Our bodies do, right? And when we're operating in it, that actually ends up being the same pattern that we were seeing when people are feeling things like compassion and appreciation and so on. We switch modes into a highly efficient functional state. So then that also mirrors the literal frequencies we're broadcasting and radiating out into the environment. There's a mathematical relationship between the rhythms of the heart and the information in the field. Now, I hope that made sense.
Okay, I think I'm with you. But coherence, first thing I think of is, oh, my heart rate's slowed down and it's, and I'm calm and collected. But it's more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, you're talking about relaxation.
Relaxation. Okay.
All right, so let's talk about the word coherence. If you look it up in the dictionary, the first definition usually has to do with, like now we're having a conversation. And hopefully I'm putting my words together in a string and in a way that conveys a meaning past all the individual words. In other words, as in a coherent argument or a coherent statement. And if I'd had a little bit too much to drink this morning, and I'm uttering nonsense, you would say I'm
not coherent.
I'm incoherent, right?
You're incoherent.
Exactly.
So that's kind of the common people level of it. But it's really similar in science and physics. And coherence is a concept used pretty universally in science and physics now. And in general, we use the word coherence when we're talking about complex systems, like us, or even a cell is an extremely complex system, living system. So within the physics and science context, coherence has a lot of related meanings that are kind of umbrellaed. It means that the parts of a system have to be in communication. So it implies connectedness and correlation among the parts, right? Because they have to somehow talk to each other to be working together in a harmonious way to give rise to a function that's beyond the sum of the parts. And it also implies energy efficiency in a coherent system. So we use coherence if we're talking about the cosmos. It's a common term, right? Or certainly if we're talking about our physiology. So to be in a coherent physiological state, or heart rhythm coherence as we now call it, that means a lot is going on in our bodies that we've actually shifted into a more efficient functional state. So, which we're also now vibrating, if you will, oscillating at our natural resonant frequency. So, in other words, the heart, lung, brain, blood pressure rhythms are all synchronizing. They're doing less work to get more done.
Got it.
And that's where...
And the heart and brain come into synchrony as well. The activity of the heart and brain.
And that's where your instruments and the work that you're doing at the HeartMath Institute are designed to do?
Well, yes. So that was early. All the stuff I'm talking about now goes back into the 90s in our work. So that once we really understood the physiology in this new functional state, I mean, it's always been there.
Sure.
Right? I mean, we're always coherent, incoherent. People have been in these states all along. We were just kind of the first to look at it more deeply and say, wow, look what happens. And by the way, I'm kind of rambling here, but at that time, when you search the medical literature, I think I could find 3 papers that had to do with what we would think of as positive emotions.
Wow.
Thousands on things like stress, anxiety, depression, right? 3 on...
What a waste.
On positive. Now that's changed, and there's a whole new movement called positive psychology and all this going on out there.
But if we study why people keep saying that is so valuable.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, the point is not very few researchers that actually looked at what's going on when we feel good. It was all focused on, the negative side, right? Anyway, once we identified the state, and it was so clear that we naturally go into this functional mode called coherence, this optimal state, when we feel good. You walk out, you may not say this, but you walk out the door to yourself, in other words, in the morning, and it's one of those days, the blue skies and the perfect, you just go, oh God, what a beautiful day. You're feeling appreciation of how I mean it. You may not think that, and you're naturally going into this more coherent state.
that kind of like being in the zone?
Well, it would be what underlies being
Right.
in the zone,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
Yeah.
if that makes sense, Clay.
It does. It does. It just every once in a while I hit a straight golf ball. It
Mhm.
feels so good.
Well, being you're a golfer, you retake up your coherence practices because it's huge. A lot of golfers have found if they get coherent before they take the shot, there's over 400 studies now on people when they learn how to get independent of us that have followed up on our research that we feel better and we perform better, whether it's golf or Olympic athletes, whatever, tennis. I mean, the list goes on. A lot of professional athletes use it now as well.
Rollin, I want to go back to this idea that it takes less, that we could solve so much of the world's problems with less than 10% of the defense budgets.
Mm-hmm.
What is between that solution and where we are now? And how can what you're doing and the things that we're doing in the science get us to that very, very sane place?
An evolution of consciousness. And so from my perspective, consciousness is evolving.
Right. So we are, if we are going through, are we, because it feels to me that that whatever the imperative was to go from the chimpanzee and the bonobo to the hominid to the something is happening now, that there is an evolutionary imperative. Mm-hmm. Something is going on that we're going into, and it is an evolution in consciousness, and that's where it's happening.
Yeah, and if that word is kind of strange or unfamiliar, consciousness, call it awareness, or maturity, right?
Yes,
because they're all kind of interchangeable in a way.
So we're in our human species. We're at I don't know where you would be. Are we in the teens? Are we in our teens as a species? Are we evolving that we can evolve into a?
Yeah, we're probably not quite to our teens yet. I've never used this analogy for, but if you think about it, when we were little kids.
Yeah.
So I grew up in the Midwest in a time, that's very different than I think these days. And there was a period, I don't remember how old I was, that the backyard was our boundary. Mm-hmm. Right. And then as we matured and we developed a certain level of self-regulation, right? Like be home by dark, I mean, literally.
Exactly.
Right. Then the block became the boundaries, and off playing with the other kids and their places and that. And then there was the next boundary with the next level of maturity and capacity to self-regulate was now, you look before you cross the street so you don't get ran over and, kind of basic stuff, but it really was maturing, and awareness. Then in my days, the town became the next boundary.
Certainly.
Right? Probably same for you guys. We're similar age.
Neighbors looking out for one another. If I did something and that it was reported back, it was.
That too. But the point is I'm making, we are our awareness was evolving.
Absolutely.
Right. And for a lot of people, we graduate high school or we graduate college, that kind of stops.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If you get where I'm going with that.
Yeah. It's like going back to high school reunion, 40 years later and pick up right where you left off.
Yeah. And I think relevant to what you guys are talking about on your interviews and shows a lot, it's also through those same years is when a lot of our natural kindness and compassion and stuff kind of gets beat out of us.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
If you will, and especially later in that development process. So I just kind of use that as a backdrop or an analogy for what I mean, to where, we start evolving to where it makes more sense, even for our own, and many, many studies bear out what I'm about to say here, that it's really collaborating with others and being kind and compassionate is the best for our own careers and certainly for our relationships. I was just, before you even invited me to this, I was just reading something. What women want most in men is kindness.
It's amazing. It's extraordinary what we can do. And what I love about that, and what Clay and I have certainly experienced and all, is that it's there. It's our nature. it gets I love the way you were saying it was beaten out of us, or it was layered over, or whatever, and it's a deconstruction that gets it back to our natural state, which is love.
Yeah, so we have to unlearn a lot of what we,
Yeah.
at least I've had to,
Me too. So much of that has been part of that. So where are you now, Rollin? Tell me what your work is in helping to elevate the consciousness, or to bring into the coherence.
Well, the reason I got involved 30 some years ago, after in fact, she sold my electrostatics company for way less than it was worth. Kind of to quickly exit and do what I do now, was met the founder of HeartMath, Doc Childry is his name. And so I'll just tell you the real story here of how that all began. He was on the East Coast in North Carolina area, and I was back there doing some work from our company on the Research Triangle area, and I was introduced through some mutual friends through the earlier years. I was talking about the consciousness studies and all that. And this character sounds interesting. I'll go pop over, spend an hour, meet the guy, and 3 days later, I left. True story, actually. And through that, he was talking about his history, and we had a lot of similar backgrounds, both from being in our early years, being raised in poor families and farming communities, and mine was in Missouri and Nebraska, that area. And all the kind of school of hard knocks that we'd kind of gone through, if you will. And what he had studied very deeply, a lot of things that was similar to me, had just gone a lot deeper than I had. And was talking about the heart, not just as a metaphor, and through my meditation practices, we would meditate and whip energy through the heart chakra and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So I was very adept at that through those practices, but it was never really taking the heart seriously, as in the way I would tend to describe it now. I'm going to diverge a little bit here to really answer your question. We have the physical heart, but we also have what we now call the energetic heart. And I'm saying it's real, and it's a real structure. It's just at the vibrational level, that thing we can't yet put under the microscope. And that's the bridge, or the transceiver, to use my communications language, to what here I just call it the large or larger self. Mm-hmm. That's vibrating at a higher dimension, and literally in a higher dimension, or
Sure.
a different dimension of density is the way I really think of it. But anyway, a lot of people would call it their higher self, or their spirit, or their soul.
Sure.
Just saying, I'm here to say that's real, and that the heart is the bridge to that. And I'll go as far as saying, in my own personal experience and our research, that's an eye of a needle that you just can't bypass. Right, and it is really getting the mind to finally surrender to that other level of intelligence that elevates awareness and consciousness. That gets us to rise above our judgments and our biases and our kind of 3D level consciousness. It's a long story made really short there, but
compelling. It's compelling me because it makes me want to know more. Yeah. That's what because for me, when you talk about the heart having intelligence, mm-hmm. and it having its that there is an intelligence there, and that we tap into it, then that is real.
Yeah, and that is what elevates consciousness, is tapping into that flow of information.
So could we say that compassion, when we're searching for compassion, we're searching for it both in ourselves and searching for it out because there is value in that search.
Yeah. So what opens? So I think of this this mechanism, or this network I was just talking about, very much like radio systems. I can't help it. I'm an ex-radio guy, right?
Yep.
But it really is like that. It's a signaling system between different dimensions, if you will. I mean, the magnetic fields are all around you right now in the room you're in, right? Clay and Dennis, and here, all the cell phone conversations. So when we get our phone out, how do we get the information we want? We tune the receiver to be resonant with the frequency of interest. And as soon as we do that, we transfer the energy and information and amplify it up and are having our phone call. I'm just saying we work the same way between our larger self, right? And so that level of our own the undivided wholeness is another way of saying it, is in communication with via the energetic heart right down to the DNA level, to all the cells. And who are we talking to anyway when we go deeper and talk to ourselves inside?
Yes.
We get I'm not talking about mental chatter now. I'm talking about those deeper, right, core understandings of who we are and what we're here to be and who we really are. And those kinds
I love having these conversations, Rollin and Clay, because the I know that this conversation might not have made a lot of sense to me before, but because of the depth of the learning and the studies that I'm doing, I'm be able to see, and I'm trying to think about this conversation in 50 years that would be very prosaic, that the people would be really talking about. This is the normal part of conversation rather than something esoteric.
Yeah, that reminds me, I hadn't thought about this in years, but your comment, before I tell you this story though, I don't want to lose the point that it is those heartfelt feelings of appreciation, compassion, kindness, care, love that opens that channel that I'm talking about. So you can't get through that eye of the needle with just the mind, the judgments and the biases and all the sorting that the mind wants to do. But the story you just reminded me of, I'm actually an official mad scientist. True story. It's I've got it back here. Quite a few years ago now, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. Wired magazine selected, I think 3, maybe 4, what they considered mad scientists. They actually have a whole center page. They did cartoons of us.
Nice.
But here's the point that made your comment reminded me of. To be qualified to be a mad scientist, is we had to be doing work that was kind of considered far out and kind of wacky, but a generation or two from now would be considered common sense. That's what reminded me of that.
Yeah, and that's where I see this, and that's where I see this going. Yeah. I see that because the opportunity, because when we look at something that is mad, and mad is spending less than 10% of the budget of the military that we have of destruction that could end up solving all of the problems of poverty. That's madness.
It is, isn't it? It's a problem.
So you're going to say we're moving to sanity as opposed to being something outrageous. That is that anyone looking at that would go, that's insane.
Mm-hmm. Clay, you want to?
Yeah. So we've been talking about the individual pretty much. Mm-hmm. And so I've got a field around me. Mm-hmm. There's something bigger going on that you're involved with. And I want to hear about that.
Okay. All right. So I wanted to give that background that we
Absolutely.
are fields because, all right. So God, how do I go into this? So let me just tell you the evolution of our Cliff Notes version of our research. Okay, so we can measure fields out here. We can take the information and see that it's carrying information, probably about a whole lot more of it emotions, but for sure about our emotional state. So what we're feeling inside doesn't stop at the skin. We're broadcasting it. And I think everybody knows that we can feel that from others.
We've seen that. Someone walks into a room and the entire atmosphere changes. We know that. We've seen everyone's experience.
Yeah, we know that and have seen it. So I'll just give you the quick notes here. The next step in our research will say, okay, well, that's neat. So what? Does that have measurable effects on other people? And that was an easy question to answer, actually. And there's multiple studies for people that want the hardcore research on all this. Sure. They're all published. In other words, our physiology is exquisitely tuned to receiving and responding to the amplitude and frequencies of other biologically generated fields. Now, we're tuned to each other. So not only are we radiating, we're also receiving and measurably affected by others. Okay? You kind of already alluded to that, Dennis. So that's all published.
Yes.
All right, so now we'll take it bigger. So that's the living room level. Right? Then So then we got into, I'm going to skip our intuition research. That's a whole other topic. Maybe we can talk about it another time. But to answer Clay's question, this is where we get into what's called the Global Coherence Initiative, or GCI. And so we start we now have a global network of really ultra-sensitive magnetometers that are specifically designed to measure the resonant frequencies or the vibrations in the Earth's magnetic field. So we have these sites. I wish we didn't have to do this ourselves. It's really expensive and a real pain in the rear to do. But we've got sites, one here in California, northern Canada, Saudi Arabia, Lithuania, New Zealand. I'm probably forgetting some, but so this is this global network that we're able to literally measure the rhythms of the Earth, is what the magnetic field. So let me give a little context here. When we, I have a little prop over there. It's just too far away for me to reach right now. But if you think of the Earth, right, and you've got the geomagnetic field, the thing our compasses tune into,
Sure.
The North Pole, the South Pole. We all learned about that back in probably junior high in our era. And, if you remember back to when we were in grade school or whenever it was, you got to dump iron filings. I hope you guys got to do that, right? On a glass plate.
Absolutely.
You put your magnet under it. Yeah. You put your magnet under it, you move it around, and it was fun. You play with it, and it visualizes the shape of the magnetic field. But here's what I want to go one more level. If you think back, those iron filings lined up in lines, right? It wasn't just kind of black blob. They're all, so those are also visualizing, not only are you seeing the shape of the field, depending on whether it's a bar or a ball or whatever, those are letting us see what are called magnetic field lines. Okay? Or flux lines if we're using engineering terms. But anyway, the Earth's magnetic field, this big donut or toroidal shape around the planet, which goes out into space many, many thousands of miles, is the same way, magnetic field lines. Now here's what we didn't learn, at least I didn't back then, is that you can pluck magnetic field lines and they vibrate just like a guitar string.
Really?
Yeah. And it's a great analogy. I mean, any stringed instrument, but let's use guitar. You change the length of the string and the tension, it changes its vibration, right? Its note, or its frequency. Same way with Earth. So we've got really long magnetic field lines, so they have a lower frequency. Now, what's plucking these magnetic field lines, and in fact, the science term for this is called field line resonances. Okay, so what's plucking the strings is the solar wind rushing by, which is about 1 million miles per hour. And meanwhile, Earth is turning, and so is the sun, right? In fact, Earth is within the magnetic field of the sun, right? So there's all these levels of fields. We live within fields, right? So the magnetic field lines are vibrating. And so when we measured the frequency of these vibrating field lines down here on Earth through our global network of magnetometers, in frequency language, one of the primary resonant frequencies is a frequency called 0.1 hertz. Okay, that's a cycle every 10 seconds. And guess what the frequency of the human coherent heart rhythm is?
0.1.
0.1. I'm going to pause a minute and let that soak in. Okay, so part two, think back to science class when we were back in middle school or whatever it was, and we got to play with tuning forks, right? Or if you didn't, everybody's seen the examples,
Sure.
right? You have two tuning forks, the same tune to the same note. You tap one, the other starts to magically vibrate. It's demonstrating what's called resonant coupling.
Oh, okay. I had that with my guitars.
Absolutely, you can do it. It clocks on a wall. Guitars, you can hit one, the same note, the other starts to vibrate.
Right.
With it. Absolutely, resonant coupling. And all that is showing is you can transfer energy and information when systems vibrate at the same frequency. Same back to our cell phones. All those frequencies we tune. You guys are old enough too. Remember back when you have to turn knobs on radios?
Oh yeah.
Right, you're literally moving the plates within a capacitor to change the resonant frequency. Then once you hit the right frequency, boom, you're listening to your radio station or having your phone call. So that's just the simple basics of if our physiology is vibrating, oscillating at the same frequency as the primary frequencies of Earth, it's not a big jump to understand how we can be transferring energy and information from us to the bigger field. Am I making sense here? You follow?
Yes. Yes.
Not only are we, when we're radiating our frequencies, love, compassion versus, impatience, anger, frustration, we're not only feeding our local field, that is coupling to the larger field. So all of humanity is now contributing to the larger global field, the information being carried by the larger field.
And so if this large population is vibrating the same, then we're sending some stuff out.
Yeah, well, we're receiving it, and we're radiating. So that next evolution that we're talking about in consciousness, kind of one of the sayings here that for GCI that's kind of naturally emerged is, please become aware of what are you feeding the field.
Absolutely.
Right. So
absolutely.
So one of my calls to action, usually before I get done with most presentations or talks, is, hey, pause throughout today and just ask yourself that: what am I feeding the field? Because that part 2 of that is what we feed the field matters.
I love that, because if that means that everything matters, that means that I can make a difference by changing. I love the word mindful, because it gives me an opportunity to look at it rather than in a binary state. I get to look at it along the spectrum, that I can become more mindful, moving toward the one and moving in that direction to become more coherent.
Yeah, I mean, mindful is a great term, and back in the, what would have been 80s for me, I studied mindfulness and practiced that during that era. And, and it's really great because, mindful or mindfulness is really becoming more self-aware of what we're thinking and feeling, and hopefully more objective about it, and as an observer. But I would also like to suggest, if I may, that as we evolve a little more, that mindful term will probably fade away, and it'll become more about being more heartful.
Heartful. I love that, because I mean, that brings us around to compassion, and it brings us around to using this as a power, and really to being able to leverage it.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So we have a lot more. I mean, there's so much. 30 years of research. It's hard to cram 30 years of that into an hour here, but
goodness, no.
Kind of it's really important, I think, to understand that radio knob we were talking about, we have one inside of us. And we have a lot more capacity and power to tune our own dial than we think, to align with our larger self, and really become more energetically responsible for what we're feeling and thinking and what we're radiating into the field. And there's a lot of, if you don't want to do it because you have care for other people, well, do it for yourself.
Exactly. But the thing that I find interesting, Rollin, is that everything that I have studied from any of the masters in spirituality, any of the scientists, that they are talking about the same thing. That you're bringing this, you are applying the science to what all the great teachers that I have ever studied were either implying or directly saying.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. It's true, absolutely. And it's also true in the scientific community. And I've had the honor, I would say, to meet a lot of pretty well-known scientists over my career, and we've had a lot of them have visited here, and it kind of reminds me of a conference we had here on the question that was being discussed was, are quantum processes involved in brain function and brain activity? So we had, like Roger Penrose was here, and Carl Pribram, and just about 30, similar names, right? And so they were here for about a week, and we had a lot of time to hang out at night and, around a campfire in some cases and stuff, and just talk and get to know each other. And Basil Hiley, David Bohm had already passed away, but his main was here, contributor of his. And for example, and having these kind of discussions, kind of like we're having now, we talk about a larger self that really guides and directs the physiology. And all of these guys were, well, of course it's that way. It's really true. I mean, the really great minds and thinkers have absolutely no problem with the discussion we're having today. And it's kind of obvious to them, that it's really I'm going to be kind here, but the scientist wannabes, maybe, you're kind of climbing the ladder and you're really stuck in the dogma and religion. And to me, science has become the new religion, and it's just as dogmatic as religion.
Of course.
Yeah.
So fortunately, I work in a nonprofit research center here, so I don't have to worry about tenure and don't really, have to play that game to the same way. The people who resist this kind of things, they're still stuck at that lower level. They haven't really matured enough and their awareness to really understand that, to me, even from a childhood, frankly, the idea that a lightning bolt hit a pond of mud, millions of years ago, and we evolved into who we are now against all the laws of thermodynamics is just absolutely absurd.
Yeah.
I could never could. And I know all the models or not all, but a lot of the models about, self-organization and all that. But even that falls apart with a little deeper thinking.
This whole time, what keeps coming through my head is, I work with men. I've got a men's circle. I've got a network around the world. How do we take this to action? The guy that's, he doesn't know about all this stuff, but he's searching. He's got this hole inside of him, and he's trying to figure out, what do I do? How do I get unstuck?
Well, that's I think you were one of the early adopters in a way, but that's really why HeartMath exists. The HeartMath Institute is to provide practical, research-based, not that matters, but it's a nice add-on, approaches, tools, techniques that we really can use to really grow in our capacity to self-regulate, to have more control over our emotional diet, and become more self-aware and able to make, I call them turnarounds. What I mean by that, Clay, by a turnaround is somebody does something, that frustrates us, or there goes that typical, almost automated, unconscious reaction.
Right.
Frustration, impatience, anger, whatever that is. And the analogy I like to use, it's like the train's leaving the station. Because the train's pretty good, it's building up momentum. And I've actually had, I'm sure you have too, the experience of that train gets too far down the track, that emotional train I'm talking about. You're sitting there watching going, oh, shit. Probably shouldn't say that. Oh, boy. There it goes. I see it happening, and I know the play out, and it's too far down the track. We can't stop it and turn it around.
That reminds me, I should have pulled it up, but sitting way across over there on my bookshelf is a little book called Freeze Frame.
Ah, yes, our first book.
Your first book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the whole point when I say turnarounds is it takes a little bit of practice. But once that emotion starts building, and this is not about suppressing, that never works, but it's about turning that energy around and shifting that same energy, into a neutral, or with practice, it can even be appreciation, compassion, care, kindness. But and then that does nothing but benefit us, our immune system, our hormonal system. Gets us into that coherent state. We're able to think better, clearer, make better decisions. So it just takes some practice. But, most people just haven't been taught.
Yeah. Well, hopefully some folks will listen to the podcast, and it's getting out there. It's being picked up in several places in Africa now.
Wow. Congratulations.
Yeah. I'm very, very happy with it. And I know your time is tight, and I want to invite you back.
I'd love to. This was fun. This is very different than most types of conversations.
Well, I'm really trying to communicate, and, probably about as many women watch this as men. Mm-hmm. And same with my websites. The stats show that sometimes there are more women on the website than there are men. Yeah. They're looking for a resource for their man. And the HeartMath message is a very powerful one. And I'm really grateful that you took some time this afternoon.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And please come back.
Oh, just let me know when I'd like to, and we'll find a time.
Great. Thank you so much, Rollin.
I love that you're giving me the opportunity to exit the conversation at a higher level than I entered it, at a higher level of consciousness, Rollin. Thank you for this opportunity to open my mind and to really to get into my heart and to really to explore that, to be heartful, and to, because I can experience it now. I can explore it and work into that place. Thank you so much for this time. Clay, thank you for allowing me to be along this journey in search of the new compassionate male in myself and in you, Rollin, and to be able to see the beautiful examples that we have, because we're going on from here on. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening to podcasts, and there will be more coming. So stay tuned. We will see you in search of the new compassionate male next time.
Check out the latest episode of In Search of the New Compassionate Male on your favorite podcast station.